There's a common narrative that the practice of religion and the study of religion are at odds with one another, a war between believers and scholars, practitioners and academics. And this narrative, while having some good historical precedent, does not necessarily have to be the case, and certainly not remain so. The study of religion is not only interesting and important in mankind's attempt to understand itself, but is also of value to religious practitioners looking to better understand their own practices, and also to non-religious individuals looking to deepen their lives with the techniques, rituals, and practices cultivated by religion over the millennia. In this episode, we're going to examine religious rituals and try better understand them with an overview of the academic study of ritual. We're going to begin with a basic overview of different types of ritual, followed by a brief discussion on the function and form of ritual and the beginning of the scholarship, followed by a historical sketch of the leading theories and theorists of ritual, and conclude with some closing words about what we might learn from the study of ritual, what it might teach us about rituals, and what it might teach us about ourselves. I hope you enjoy. Engaging with the academic study of ritual has personally helped provide me with a context to make sense of my own practice in ways that have been both existentially and religiously meaningful to me. I hope that this elucidation might do the same for you, regardless of what your practice looks like. We're going to be relying heavily here on the work of the American religious studies scholar Catherine Bell, who is not only one of the foremost contemporary theoreticians of ritual in her own right, who contested some of our most basic assumptions about ritual and turned the field on its head, as we shall see, but she also provided an incredibly lucid overview of the history of scholarship leading up to and following her. It is to her that this presentation, which follows her structure, research, and wording, is dedicated and highly indebted. I don't know if you know this feeling, but sometimes you just find a piece of research which is so well done that you just want to share it more or less with everyone you know. This is essentially that. I take no credit here for originality, neither in content nor form. This is really just an opportunity to pass on Bell's fantastic, brilliant scholarship, and what an honor that is. Together with Professor Bell's help, we're going to provide a very basic introduction to the study of ritual. If you are motivated to learn more and continue studying on your own, I will provide resources and recommendations to both her work and to other important works in the field, both on screen as we go through the presentation and down below in the description of the video. I encourage you to not see this as a complete comprehensive introduction to ritual, but merely as a taster that you can go ahead and explore further with the resources provided. If you appreciate the work that we are doing here, of providing a critical yet sympathetic lens to key subjects in the world of religious studies and comparative mysticism, please do consider supporting us via a one-time donation via PayPal or a recurring donation via Patreon. Your support means a lot to us, and this is really what allows me to continue doing this work that I love to do, of bringing together the sharpest minds and the softest hearts in the study of religion in the hopes of creating a kinder and more thoughtful world together. Join us in supporting the project if you'd like to see more of it. And now, on to ritual. The word ritual itself derives from the Latin ritualis, namely that which pertains to ritus, namely the prescribed and correct way of doing something. Ritual makes its way into the English language in the late 16th century with the meaning of the prescribed order of performing religious services, or more specifically, the liturgical texts containing said correct ceremonial order for liturgical services. But in attempting to explore what a ritual is, I'm going to avoid giving any neat and conclusive definition. If you thought you were going to get a quick answer here to what ritual means, that is just too bad, I'm sorry. If you would like a brief history and overview of the going definitions of ritual, check out my colleague Andrew Mark Henry of Religion for Breakfast's fantastic episode on the subject here. But what I would like to do instead is present some of the ways that ritual has been classified in order to better understand the various ways that it shows up in the real world and not merely in textbook definitions. There have been various taxonomies, that is, systems of classification, proposed to classify ritual, from Emil Durkheim's minimalistic taxonomy, dividing ritual into just two classes, negative rites and positive rites, namely negative rituals such as taboos, which keep us away from the sacred, and positive rituals such as communion rites, which attempt to bring us close to or in contact with the sacred. All the way to maximalist taxonomies on the other end of the spectrum, like Roland Grimes, which catalogs no less than 16 different forms of ritual: rites of passage, marriage rites, funeral rites, festivals, pilgrimage, purification, civil ceremonies, rituals of exchange, sacrifice, worship, magic, healing rites, interaction rites, meditation rites, rites of inversion, and ritual drama. Catherine Bell proposes a sweet spot of ritual taxonomies, a compromise between conciseness and comprehensiveness, with her 6 categories of ritual. And they are as follows. Number 1 are rites of passage, also known as life cycle rites, which are rituals and ceremonies that mark important transitions from one stage of life to another, be they rituals pertaining to birth, maturation, marriage, reproduction, or death. Number 2 are calendrical or commemorative rites, which are rituals that mark the passage of time, and these fall into 2 categories. First are seasonal rituals, which pertain to cycles of planting and harvesting for agriculturalists, or grazing and herding for pastoralists. And number 2 are historical rituals, pertaining to culturally significant historical events, whether they are calendrically accurate or not at the time that they are being commemorated. Category number 3 are rites of exchange and communion, which are rituals in which offerings are made to the deity or deities to praise, please, or placate them, usually with the expectation of receiving something in return, be it something like a good harvest and long life, or something more abstract like grace or redemption. Category number 4 are rites of affliction, which are rituals which attempt to rectify a certain misfortune or affliction, such as rituals attempting to heal, exorcise, protect, or purify the afflicted. Number 5 are rituals of feasting, fasting, and festivals, which are rituals pertaining to and consisting of major communal fasts, feasts, or festivals, which express and generate religious and/or cultural values and sentiments. Number 6 are political rituals, which are ceremonial practices that construct, display, and promote the political interests of distinct constituencies or the power of political institutions, such as the monarchy, state, or the village elders. In Bell's own admission, these 6 categories overlap in messy ways, are open-ended, and are not exhaustive of the ways in which people ritualize, but are nonetheless an incredibly helpful framework to begin to think about ritual and apply some order to an expansive and sometimes orderless subject nonetheless. This question of what exactly is ritual is a surprisingly recent one. For most of the history of the usage of the term, people, including scholars, just took for granted that we all knew what we meant when we spoke of ritual. It's only really in the past few decades that serious, systematic attempts have been made to define and classify exactly what rituals are. And no spoilers here, but ritual began to be used as a term of anthropological study in the 20th century as part of an attempt to understand the origins of religion. In these early studies, the term was used to uncover what was common to all so-called primitive religions. This discovered commonality between the primitive religions helped early Christian scholars distance Christianity from these other earlier religions, which was an important agenda for them. But it also ended up inadvertently revealing the ways in which Christianity was not so different from other religions when examined from the perspective of ritual. Another challenge that the study of ritual faced was the Protestant disdain and distrust for rites and rituals. This Protestant-inspired aversion to rituals simultaneously accused ritual of 2 opposing sins, both of being excessively pompous and formal, corrupting a prior pristine innocence of religion, and of exhibiting vestigial remains of primitive, underdeveloped, and illiterate forms of religion. it's hard sometimes to catch a break. Even today, despite decades of study and advanced liberal attitudes in our approach to religions and ritual, there is still an underlying bias that equates ritual practice with primitive attitudes, and ritual still carries connotations of thoughtlessness, route, and dogmatism in contemporary society. Perhaps we can have a hand in helping to undo a little bit of that. Despite the various prejudices that it faced, ritual became an important independent subject of study in the late 19th century. Since then, ritual has been analyzed from the perspectives of anthropology, history, sociology, and psychology, and more recently from religious studies and interdisciplinary perspectives. And ritual has also been examined through the lenses of psychoanalysis, functionalism, phenomenology, structuralism, culturalism, performance studies, and practice theory. What I hope to do today with you is go over some of the key theorists and theories that have constituted the grand study of religion. Firstly, because I'm a sucker for theory, and secondly, because I hope that we'll come away with a fuller understanding of ritual with the help of some of the brightest minds that applied lifetimes of hard work to understanding and elucidating this elusive category. The following will be a roughly chronological overview of the key thinkers and thoughts over the past century or so, which have shaped our modern understanding of ritual. We're going to start with the Scottish scholar William Robertson Smith. William Robert Smith, a talented linguist and Old Testament scholar, is best known for his work Religion of the Semites, a foundational text in the comparative study of religion in which he reconstructs early Semitic ritual practices of the sacrificing and consuming of totem animals. Robertson Smith was one of the first to argue for the centrality of ritual in primitive religion. Smith's big theory was that religion and even civilization itself originated in the bond created by the communal participation in the act of ritual sacrifice to the community's divine totem, which was taken to be a representation of the divine ancestor of the clan. According to Robertson Smith, the aim of this Semitic ritual sacrifice was to unite the human with the divine and, as a consequence, unite the participating community into one cohesive, sanctified social unit. Rituals for Robertson Smith, therefore, serve to both create and maintain community and social cohesion, and, as such, are the bedrock of religion, society, and civilization. Next up, we have Robertson Smith's student and colleague, James George Frazer. Like his predecessor, James George Frazer argued for the centrality of ritual. He believed that ritual was the original source of most of cultural life. Frazer built on his predecessor's work on the sacrifice of the totem animal, expanding it to elaborate his theory of a universal motif underlying all of mythology, his monomyth of the death and resurrection of a god, which was then reenacted in rituals across the world, according to Frazer, of the death and sacrifice of the divine king. Frazer, in his huge and massively influential 12-volume study of mythology and ritual entitled The Golden Bough, argued for the centrality and universality of the myth of the dying and reborn god. And he argued that the fundamental ritual across cultures was the symbolic sacrificial killing of the king, in whose death and resurrection the fertility of the land and crops, the agriculture so important to the common people, were likewise reborn. Among those influenced by Robertson Smith and Frazer and their myth and ritual school were a group of scholars known as the Cambridge Ritualists, who would go on to make use of Frazer's dying and rising god model to analyze all kinds of literature, mythology, and folklore, finding these patterns nearly everywhere that they looked. The precise relationship between myth and ritual and the question of which came first and which produced the other and how is a major part of the story of the scholarship of religion, which we're going to have to skip for the moment if we want this class to remain any shorter than, 2 hours. So, on to the sociological study of ritual with Emil Durkheim. Emil Durkheim, the famed French father of sociology, inaugurated a new trend in the study of ritual. Instead of focusing on the origins of ritual in society, Durkheim brought our attention to the function of rituals in society. In 1912, Durkheim published his Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, which established religion not merely as an isolated psychological experience, but as a collective social phenomenon. In Durkheim's influential view, the primary function of religion is to organize individuals in society, and around this view, Durkheim constructed his sociological perspective, which analyzed ritual as a conglomerate of social institutions and a way of organizing people in and around them. At the core of Durkheim's social theory of religion was the distinction that religion creates between the sacred and the profane, a distinction which Durkheim takes to be the root of all religion. For Durkheim, religious beliefs are there to express the nature of the sacred, while religious rituals are the rules of conduct which govern how one in a given society should act and interact in the presence of the said sacred. Durkheim innovatively argues that periodic rituals in which communities gather to worship and venerate their symbols of the sacred generate experience of collective effervescence for the community, namely intense and passionate states of mind in which the community comes to identify their innermost selves with their gods, with the sacred. Durkheim takes this one step further by arguing that ideas of the sacred, such as venerated ancestors or the gods, are actually a figurative expression of the society itself, collectively projected representations of the social group. What rituals do then is allow the members of the community to identify themselves with their collective projections onto the objects of the sacred, internalizing their self-identity with the community as a whole through the medium of the sacred in the act of the ritual. It is through ritual activities, therefore, for Durkheim, that a society sanctifies its social structure and becomes a moral community aligned with their own fundamental assumptions about reality itself. Pretty wild stuff, Emil. Following Durkheim, his student, the British anthropologist Mary Douglas, the author of Purity and Danger and Natural Symbols, was instrumental in putting to bed the notion of primitive religion by demonstrating that the default analysis of so-called primitive religions or rituals was informed by the Protestant disdain for ritual that we touched upon earlier. Drawing on Turner, Durkheim, Lévi-Strauss, and others, Douglas, in her 1970 Natural Symbols, presented a way of categorizing society based on two metrics, which she referred to as grid and group. Grid determines how much structure there is in a given society, and group measures the strength of community within that society. Douglas argued that societies with greater degrees of either grid or group exert greater control over their constituents and exhibit greater degrees also of ritual, while societies with lesser degrees of either grid or group were more tolerant and less controlling, and also exhibited more individualism and less rituals. In regards to ritual itself, Douglas argued that rituals acted as a form of communication, which, like speech, are interpersonal and, in her estimation, generally function as a constraint on social behavior and help maintain social structure and status quo. Two further students of Durkheim, Henry Herbert and Marcel Mauss, wrote an important short monograph in 1898 called Sacrifice, which introduced an influential new idea into the sociological study of ritual. Herbert and Mauss argued that what mattered most in a ritual is not the emotional effervescence experienced during the ritual, as Durkheim had proposed, but rather the sequence of the ritual itself. According to Herbert and Mauss's study, what happens in the unique ritual of sacrifice is that the sacrificial object is made sacred, enabling it to function as a medium and go-between the divine and human realms, a point of contact between the two, which allows for a connection, or at least a sense of connection and union, between the ritual practitioner and the sacred, between the human and God. But following this union between the human and the divine, the realm of the human must be desacralized, must be made profane again to re-establish the necessary distinctions between the human and the divine, the mundane and the sacred. The outcome of that process is that the realm of the sacred, which is separate and distinct from the realm of the human, is, in effect, created and maintained. The core objective of religion, in their estimation, is just that, to create and maintain a sacred realm, and it is accomplished precisely through the structure of the ritual act of sacrifice. The next theory that we're going to look at does not come from a scholar of ritual per se, but from a psychologist, whose theories have been invoked by scholars of ritual following him and therefore is worth mentioning. Erikson was a German-American psychoanalyst who had an interesting theory about the role of ritual in the development and maturation in both the life of the individual and in the collective maturation of a society. Erikson believed that simple rituals begin in a pre-verbal stage in the life of the child and develop all their way to elaborate and complex rituals in the life of the adult, all of which Erikson saw as adaptive in helping socialize us into healthy social interactions and relationships. Erikson breaks down 8 neat stages of ritual development, which he later reduced to 6, which take us from pre-verbal infancy to fully functioning socialized adults. He begins with rituals enacted between a baby and mother, like playing peekaboo, from which the child learns the ability to recognize separate selfhood, both of itself and the mother, which is necessary to any process of individuation, but is able to do so through these ritual games without being overwhelmed by a sense of separation or abandonment. Next comes the rituals of early childhood, such as those found in schoolyard games, which help the child develop the ability to distinguish between wrong and right, central to the ethical development of the individual. Next, the adolescent finds group belonging and ideological conviction through group rituals as a teen, following which the rituals of adulthood teach the individual how to act responsibly and creatively within a community of humans, and so on and so forth. Erikson, following a particular popular trend in his day, makes the case that these progressive, successive, adaptive developmental rituals follow the same course in the development of the individual human, namely ontogeny, as they do in the development of the species and society as a whole, namely phylogeny, with the two mirroring each other. Or, as Ernst Haeckel put it in a now famously repudiated scientific theory, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Our next big theorist, hailing from the camp of the phenomenologists of religion, is none other than Mircea Eliade. Mircea Eliade, the Romanian historian and scholar of religion, drawing primarily on Frazer and Jung, argued that rituals symbolically act out the activity of the gods as recounted in myth, particularly the narratives of the creation of order, i.e. the cosmos, out of chaos. While myth recounts these divine narratives, ritual creates them. Ritual makes creation over again, to quote Eliade. Rituals, particularly New Year's rituals and initiatory coming-of-age rituals in Eliade's analysis, simulate and reenact that experience of chaos followed by cosmos, confusion followed by order, death followed by rebirth and life, so that we, the practitioner, may partake and participate in that cosmic cycle, reliving it and making it real over and again. For Eliade, rituals which evoke these themes of death and rebirth, chaos and order, function as reenactments of the cosmogonic myths, namely the stories that a culture tells about the beginning of time and the creation of the world. And by performing these rituals, which reenact these myths, the participants identify their passing moment in time with the primordial moments of creation in a grand eternal return. It is through the ritual enactment of these primordial events, according to Eliade, that human beings come to consider themselves truly human, sanctifying their world and bringing meaning into their lives. Building on the work of Mircea Eliade, Jonathan Z. Smith presents ritual as a process by which humans play out and dramatize a vision of how things could be as opposed to how they actually are. Ritual is first and foremost a mode of paying attention. Rituals for Smith act as a focusing lens to remind the practitioner of what really is important and valued in their lives. Rituals for Smith are necessary to keep chaos from overwhelming the cosmos, and do so by regularly reaffirming the correct order of things. Smith's concern, like Eliade's, is not in the societal function of ritual, but rather with the way rituals are conceptualized in the religious imagination of the practitioner. Smith's conclusion is that for the practitioner, rituals are a way to repair the fragmentation of human experience and the breakdown of cosmic coherence, and replace those with meaning, unity, and wholeness, affirmed and reconstructed again and again in the act of ritual. According to Smith, rituals do this by portraying an idealized version of the way that things could be. For us humans that are well aware of the constant threat that our lives might collapse into chaos and meaninglessness, rituals provide an important opportunity to step back and see the rift clearly between that which is and that which ought to be, and to remind ourselves of what really matters after all, allowing us the opportunity to frame our realities not by the fragmentation which is, but by the possibility of that which could be. I love that theory. Next up, we have Arnold van Gennep. Arnold van Gennep was a Dutch-German-French ethnographer and folklorist, the author of the Rites of Passage, in which he proposed that life cycle rituals and rites of passage achieved their desired effect upon the individual undergoing the transformation through a three-part process of separation, transition, and incorporation. First, the individual must be separated from their prior status and social context. This stage might include rituals of purification, symbolizing the stripping of one's former identity, a dying of the old self, in other words. These might involve rituals of bathing, shaving, dressing, etc. Next comes the second stage, a liminal stage of transition in which the individual is held in a state that is neither what they were prior nor what they are yet to become. The individual might, in this stage, be sequestered to a place that is outside of the normal social space for a period of gestation in which their normal routine is suspended. Then, in the third and final stage, the individual is reincorporated and welcomed back into the community, but now as a new person with a new role and identity within their society. This third stage of rebirth, or birthing of a new self effectively, might be accompanied by the bestowal of a new name or symbolic designation in addition to a festive meal. This three-part process of separation, transition, and incorporation must happen in one form or another in Van Gennep's estimation for all important transitions in life, be it from fetus to birth, childhood to adulthood, singledom to marriage, or from life to beyond. And the process, depending on the culture enacting it, may be either highly complex and lengthy with multiple sub-rituals and long liminal transitions, phases, or may be as simple and as quick as passing through a series or doors or gateways that represent the various stages of the ritual, but one way or another, all these three stages must take place in Van Gennep's estimation. Van Gennep, following the myth and ritual school that preceded him, was eager to show the universality of this three-part structure across cultures. In this aspect, we can find similarities between thinkers like Frazer, Eliade, and Van Gennep in their search for universal patterns across diverse traditions and cultures in the expectation or hope, as Van Gennep put it, that human life resembles nature, and therefore that if something is to be true about the reality of nature, we can expect to find it manifest in human behavior across cultures and vice versa. That if we find something across human cultures, we can assume that it has something to do with the nature of reality and the reality of nature. Victor Turner was a British anthropologist who built on Van Gennep's three-part structure of ritual, separation, transition, and incorporation, but focused on how rituals within a given society act to both maintain and challenge social norms and structures. For Turner, as for his predecessor, rituals work through a three-part dramatic process. For Turner, the three stages are structure, anti-structure, and restoration. We begin with structure, the status quo, followed by a liminal stage of anti-structure, which contains forms or symbols of egalitarianism, paradox, or transgression, which subvert the social structure, followed by a third and final stage, a restoration of order and structure that is able to incorporate the disorder that was generated in part 2 of the process. A good example might be a ritual of coronation in which the king-to-be is deliberately humbled by kneeling before the people only before being elevated to their new status as monarch. Rituals, for Turner, simultaneously affirm and modify the social order, like a swinging door that both opens the boundaries of a room and yet, precisely by doing so, maintains them, so you don't need to break down the wall to get in. For Turner, rituals are a way in which we act out the social conflicts between order and chaos, structure and egalitarianism. Rituals, in Turner's estimation, do not merely function as a release valve on the disruptive energies found within the community, but they give voice to the inner conflicts within a society between the dominant powers of authority and the subversive powers of fraternity, allowing them to coexist and develop together without destroying each other. And it is only ritual, in Turner's estimation, that is properly able to do so, and it does so by dramatizing the real social dynamics within a given society into this tripart dramatic form, which simultaneously affirms and inverts, legitimates and modifies the existing social order. Rituals, according to Turner, allow the pre-existing structures that hold society together to be maintained while giving them the space to change, adapt, and evolve, all without collapsing upon themselves. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the famed French anthropologist, was a student of Marcel Mauss, and, in his own words, an inconsistent disciple of Durkheim. Lévi-Strauss is best known for his anthropological studies of kinship, and through famous books of his like his 1962, The Savage Mind. Lévi-Strauss broke off from the functionalism of his predecessors, and went on to champion a new approach to anthropology, which became known as structuralism. In his theory of ritual, Lévi-Strauss, a man who loved to theorize in binaries, contrasted ritual with myth, seeing myth as verbal and ritual as nonverbal, myth as content and ritual as form, myth as that which breaks down our apparently cohesive reality into distinctions, contrasts, and oppositions, and ritual as that which takes the discrete units created by myth and puts them back together into a seamless, unified experience of reality. According to Lévi-Strauss, this project undertaken by ritual, putting the world that myth had taken apart back together, was an impossible task, dooming ritual to be desperate, maniacal, stubborn, and ineffective. And while this doesn't quite constitute a fully developed theory of ritual, Lévi-Strauss's ideas are worth mentioning because of just how influential they were on later thinkers like Mary Douglas and Edmund Leach, for example. From about the 1980s and onwards, allegiance to any particular school of theory became less important, and scholars from across disciplines and perspectives were able to draw on each other's research and the common pool of findings to further the study of ritual. Furthermore, scholars, rather than asking how rituals function in society, began to ask more questions about the ways in which rituals communicate. They began to ask, what do rituals mean? What do they say? And how do they say it? And with that, we can move on to our next scholar, Clifford Geertz. Clifford Geertz was an American anthropologist who attempted to expand our conception of religion to include all cultural systems. For Geertz, a cultural system is, simply put, a system of symbols which present a coherent worldview and picture of reality. Geertz likewise works to expand our study of ritual beyond merely those belonging to capital R religions, but also to those found in general secular culture and society. Rituals for Geertz are symbolic actions that project an idealized image of reality, showing us both how things are and how things could be. Rituals, to use his language, depict both a model of and a model for, and together they formulate a coherent conception of existence, both in actuality and in potential. In a ritual, writes Geertz, the world is lived and the world is imagined, fused under the agency of a single set of symbolic forms, turns out to be the same world. Rituals for Geertz emerge in response to a crisis of meaning, and give us a way to orient ourselves in relation to both the actual and the possible. According to Geertz, rituals are a way by which one both affirms and embodies their highest values, and the experience of coherence generated by the ritual goes on to make the rest of the practitioner's life more meaningful and manageable, grounding us in a coherent worldview and in the ethos necessary to improve upon it. Another trend in the study of ritual associated with theorists like Edmund Leach has been called the linguistic approach, in which the symbolic activity of the ritual, primarily but not exclusively the spoken elements, are seen not merely as standard communication, but rather as a performative utterance in which the words spoken create the reality which they speak. We can think, for example, of the performative utterance of "I do" in a wedding, or the naming of a child. The utterance of those words doesn't just communicate something, they create the reality which they are speaking into existence. Many of the linguistic theories of ritual were built on the theories of performative utterances developed by the British analytical philosopher J.L. Austin in his analysis of speech acts. Another related trend in the scholarship has been a re-examination of the relationship between rituals and beliefs. Whereas previously it was believed that what came first in the developmental process of a religion were the beliefs that the given religion espoused, and then, following the beliefs, came the invention and creation of rituals to enshrine and embody those beliefs and values, a newer trend in the scholarship sought to argue that what actually comes first in the history of religion are its rituals and practices, and from them emerge the religion's beliefs and values, not the reverse. Next, in the history of the scholarship of ritual, we have practice theory and performance theory. Practice and performance theory, broadly speaking, attempt to analyze the actual activity of a given ritual, the particular words, movements, and actions that go on to shape and mold the beliefs and attitudes of the practitioners. With the risk or the guarantee of oversimplifying it, practice theory attempts to understand why a ritual is employed in a given situation, while performance theory will analyze the performative aspects of a ritual, such as its script, drama, and roles, in an attempt to understand how rituals function and create their impact. And just to briefly mention some of the perspective shifts brought about by performance and practice theory, ritual, from the perspective of performance theory, is no longer merely restricted to formal ceremonies of capital R religions, but takes into account a wide range of ritual and ritual-like activities from a variety of contexts and cultures, including, but not limited to, secular ones. Ritual, from the perspective of performance analysis, is no longer limited to matters of just the mind, but takes into account the body, the senses, and the emotions. Ritual, according to performance theorists, should not be seen as static and passive, but rather as dynamic, dramatic, active, and participatory. Practice theorists tend to think of ritual in historical context, in relation to the cultural patterns which they perpetuate, reinterpret, and transform. Practice theorists are concerned with what rituals do as opposed to what they mean. They're interested in the way that ritual action interacts with issues of personal agency in everyday situations, the way that we go about dealing with the power dynamics of our daily predicaments. Practice theorists prefer to analyze the human as a whole, mind and body, as the arena in which everyday activity both reproduce and negotiate their embodied cultural experiences. And lastly, practice theorists, implicitly or explicitly, tend to question and or do away with the category of ritual as a whole, preferring to speak of embodied cultural practices or activities or forms of ritualization, which we'll see a bit more of soon. There are two final scholars of ritual whose work I would like to touch on: Roland Grimes, and the scholar whose work this presentation has been entirely based on, Catherine Bell. Roland Grimes gave the study of ritual some new wind when, in the late 70s, he coined the term ritual studies and set the field on good interdisciplinary grounding by founding the Journal of Ritual Studies. This new interdisciplinary focus and increased attention to the cultural and social dimensions of religion in general, and ritual in specific, helps scholars ease up on their attempt to find one theory of ritual to explain the whole phenomena, as if it was one thing that could be encapsulated with one theory. It rather allowed them to pay attention to the diversity and complexity of ritual as it is constructed in many unique and complex cultural contexts, differing in meaning, function, and purpose, even to complexities and differences within subcultures of a given culture. And now lastly, Catherine Bell. Catherine Bell, an American religious studies scholar, attempted to present ritual not as something separate from the rest of social activity, but within the context of social action. Bell worked to shift the discourse away from the theoretical construct of ritual towards a discussion instead of the ways in which activity is ritualized. Bell contends that all actions attempt to create situations that are advantageous to the actors. What differentiates ritual or ritualized activity from general action, then, she believes, is merely that ritual actions are set apart in their attempt to construct situations that are advantageous in the eyes of the practitioner to the authority of otherworldly sources of power and or to their worldly representatives. Ritual should then be understood and analyzed as strategic human practices that are intentionally set apart from regular activity or undertaken for the benefit of otherworldly or non-immediate ends. Bell posits that the primary way that human activity is ritualized is through precise bodily movements. According to Bell, as the body moves through space in the act of ritual, it defines what she calls the ritual space, marking off space and time into an unseen but palpable, complex schema of binaries, upper and lower, inner and outer, right and left, human, divine, older and younger, male and female, pure and impure, living, deceased, superior, inferior, etc. With a few simple moves, writes Bell, the body can define a totalizing cosmic orientation, reconstructing a complex cultural system of binary categories. The cultural arena created and interacted with by the movements, gestures, and sounds generated by the human body conveys an experience of an objective reality to those encountering and participating in the arena, even if they don't know, see, or understand how the arena and ritual environment has been created. The ultimate goal of ritual in Bell's schema is to achieve what she calls ritual mastery, namely to construct a ritualized body in which the ritual system of cultural binaries are fully absorbed, enabling a person to mold even situations that occur outside of the ritual, the power to draw the rest of what would otherwise be arbitrary reality into the objective schema created by the ritual. The final effect of ritual in Bell's account is to create the sense that a society's worldview is not merely arbitrary, but is grounded in objective reality. When expressed in ritual, this socio-cosmic order is implicitly understood as neither human nor arbitrary in its origins. Rather, it is natural and the way things really are or ought to be, to quote Bell. From the late 90s and onwards, the very category of ritual came under some scholarly heat, as we've been seeing. The distinctions used to differentiate between ritual and non-ritual activity, such as that ritual activity was related to the realm of the sacred and non-ritual activity related to the profane, or that ritual activities were non-utilitarian actions, namely actions that serve no apparent real-world purposes, and that non-ritual actions were utilitarian, all of these distinctions came into some serious questioning. In the collapse of these neat categories, ritual came to be seen as a modality, a form of social practice, rather than a specific definable human activity. Catherine Bell was one of the scholars responsible for bringing the boundaries of ritual versus non-ritual into question, preferring instead to speak of ritualization, as we mentioned, bringing our focus to the ways that people use bodily postures, gestures, and movements to create, affirm, and embody hierarchical binary systems within a community or society of ritualization, as we mentioned earlier, bring our focus to the ways that people use their bodies to ritualize as opposed to some standalone pre-existing category of ritual itself. In other words, it is the human that creates and ritualizes their own activities. That wraps up our brief and very much incomprehensive overview of some of the key theories and theorists of ritual over the past 100 years or so. We got to introduce some of the core questions, debates, issues, and theories that make up the modern study of ritual. There was, of course, a tremendous amount that we skipped over for sake of brevity. I'm sorry if I skipped or glanced over your favorite theorist. I promise it was not personal. I hope you'll forgive me. We got to see ritual as the universal embodied expression of cosmic death and rebirth. We saw ritual as a mechanism for transforming individuals into community and establishing social cohesion. We saw ritual as a means to challenge while maintain social structure. We saw ritual as a process of social transformation, for catharsis, for embodying and enacting cultural values, for healing, and for defining reality. Our intention was not to be comprehensive, but simply to provide you with a select introduction and the resources to continue learning on your own. If we try to include everything in this presentation, it would have turned into a catalog, and instead, I wanted to try here tell a story of the history of the study of ritual. The concept of ritual is, after all, as Catherine Bell starkly reminds us, a modern construct, a tool of analysis fabricated by scholars out of samplings of ethnographic descriptions and many untested assumptions, pressed into the service of explaining religious behavior in ways that are amenable to the modern Western minds. As such, the study of ritual tells us more about ourselves, those participating in the study of ritual, than it might tell us about the cultures being studied. The questions that the field asks are reflections of our questions and assumptions, and the answers provided are those that make sense to us and help us make order, coherence, and meaning out of our worlds. Our concepts and theories of ritual, created within the confines of a modern Western academic enterprise, constructed in our own image, the image of a modern culture, which distinguishes between the practice of religious activity and the study of that same activity, between activity and theory, between scholarly objectivity and cultural particularism, which is itself a distinction in practice unique to modern secular societies, which goes on to define the very field of inquiry of what should be considered ritual datum worth studying. Our theories determine whose activities are seen as ritual, and what we deem as ritual in turn shapes our theories. To ignore our own situatedness in the study and the very determination of ritual would be a grave and naive mistake. Our modern study of ritual arose in a time of great scientific hubris, in a moment of unbridled confidence that we could construct elaborate schemas that would make sense of reality and the humans therein. In turning our gaze to primitive societies and cultures, we sought to learn something about the pristine condition of humanity and nature and the relation between them, both in an attempt to master the unknown, untamed, and uncharted, and perhaps also to learn something that we had collectively forgotten. The invention of the analytical concept of ritual was born from that cultural moment, and along with the concept of myth and others, it was a core concept to that enterprise. And I don't mean to be all doom and gloom here. The concept of ritual as a comparative tool was truly quite a progressive one. Although it took some time, as we've seen, having a shared construct such as ritual to compare the religious practices and activities of one's own culture with the culture of foreigners, so-called primitives, and essentially non-European Christians, and furthermore to see the underlying commonality between them, was itself a huge leap forward in the direction of religious tolerance, understanding, respect, and ecumenicism. Ritual, despite being a modern, limited, and contested category, has become one of the most important ways through which we structure and interpret the world around us, and over the past 100 years has done a fair bit of self-conscious self-correcting, even as we continue to elucidate it and criticize it today. The beauty of the scholarly enterprise, when done right, is that it holds no sacred cows hostage in its ongoing process of critical inquiry. We engage critically with our subject, and even with the subject of our subject, not because we're jaded and cynical, but precisely because we care. And thanks to this process of critical inquiry, we may in the future, writes Bell, have better tools with which to understand what people are doing when they bow their heads, offer incense to a deity, dance in mosques in the plaza, or give a lecture on the meaning of ritual. And while our interpretation and understanding of these diverse practices may differ, and differ greatly, it cannot be amiss to see in all of these instances practices that illuminate our shared humanity. Ritual, concludes Bell, have been described as an encounter between imagination and memory translated into the physical acts of the body. Indeed, ritual appears to be a bit of psychosocial alchemy, as nimble and as inexhaustible as our imaginations and our memories. Thank you very much for joining us again. I believe that this work of religious studies, education, and communication is really important work, and I would like to continue doing it, of providing the public with free, quality, and engaging content on some of the most important and meaningful areas of life. If you feel similarly, I'd like to invite you to be a partner with me on this project by supporting us on Patreon. We're also looking to connect with some grants, if you know of any, because this material takes a serious amount of time and effort to plan, research, write, film, edit, and distribute. Allow me to continue to serve you by partnering and participating and supporting us. And thank you from the bottom of my heart to all of the patrons who have joined us already to support us. As always, keep seeking. Catch you next time.